Hi everyone, I'm Ian. There have been a lot of great wars over the years, like the Great War, but I'm not here to talk about any real wars. I'm instead here to talk about stupid, dumb, stupid, unimportant console wars. Consoles tend to be grouped into generations, with the world being in the 9th generation currently. Way back in the first generation of home consoles, it was hard to argue which one is better. There was the Magnavox Odyssey, Atari Pong consoles, and the Coleco Telstar, and there's not much to argue when all three were really just 2 to 4 lines and a circle. No big winner for this one. The second generation is where console wars really took off, mainly being the Atari 2600 versus the Intellivision. The 2600 was released first, and had really good specs for the time. The Intellivision released just 3 years later and was considered to be a big threat for the 2600. While the 2600 had better graphics, the Intellivision was a lower price and it had a very good sales strategy. But with the video game crash of 1983, neither were crowned a winner. The third generation, better known as the 8-bit era, is where rivals were truly made: Nintendo's NES and Sega's Genesis. Both consoles had a huge library of games, and they both had great reasons to buy them, but for different age groups. You may have heard of the old commercial, "Genesis does what Nintendo don't." This was one of the big pushes from Sega. The NES was a baby toy, as where the Genesis was for real men. Now, while the NES was able to stand on its own, the Genesis had to try to get some help with add-ons like the 32X and Sega CD, both of which had mediocre games and looked like growths on the Genesis. Where Sega tried to extend the life of their console, Nintendo just made a new one, the SNES, and it killed. Better graphics, better games, and even some 3D. Overall winner? Nintendo. The fourth generation is where we see a new competitor, Sony with the PlayStation. After an unreleased SNES-style disc-based system that Sony was developing with Nintendo, Sony just decided to make their own. And from its release, it took off running, with amazing characters like Crash Bandicoot, Spyro the Dragon, Lara Croft, and the entire Final Fantasy series. Nintendo, on the other hand, released the N64, and with its bunch of bananas-styled controller, it kind of flopped. Sure, it had some great games, but many people wanted more mature games, not the kid-friendly games that Nintendo was known for. And then there's Sega. Yeah, Sega really failed with the Dreamcast, although it did outsell the N64, and it had some great games too, like GTA and Resident Evil. Even through all of this, Sony, the newcomer to the console market, ended up winning this generation. After the fourth generation, Sega stopped making consoles, but we did get a new console developer, Microsoft with the Xbox. With Microsoft coming from Windows, they actually knew quite a bit about gaming. The Xbox had a more gamer aesthetic, with an almost alien-like logo and lots of green. They also had the Halo series, which was a huge deal for them. There were lots of people who bought an Xbox just to play Halo. Sony had the PlayStation 2, which had some of its own good features, like a CD and DVD player. The PS2 was also quite cheap considering what all you could do with it. It was also backwards compatible, so users could replace their PS1s and still be able to play their games. Then Nintendo had the GameCube, which used mini CDs, a very odd way to go. Mini CDs, as you may be able to tell, are smaller versions of CDs. With this, they couldn't hold as much data, meaning that games either had to be smaller or have worse graphics. It's still not completely known why Nintendo did this, though many people believe it was to help prevent pirating games. I think it's because Nintendo wanted to be difficult. At the end of this generation, there was one very clear winner: Sony. Microsoft was too new, and Nintendo just wasn't as popular as its competitors. The sixth generation of console wars actually spans across 2 generations of consoles, the 7th and 8th generations. I know, it's confusing, but trust me, it'll all make sense. Maybe. In the 6th generation, each console developer ended up having 2 consoles, and Nintendo actually had 3. Starting off, you have the Wii, which was competing with the Xbox 360 and PS3. All of them were great in their own right. None of these had any big problems. Well, except for the Wii's forced motion control use, or the 360's dreaded red ring of death, and their poor quality disk drives. We might be onto something. In the second half of this generation, all three of these developers released another console, the PS4, Xbox One, and Wii U. Now the Wii U really flopped. Dumb gimmicks, poor game developer support, and all around a mediocre console. The Xbox One did better than the 360. Well, after it had a major update. When the Xbox One released, it was required that you have a Kinect connected to the console to be able to use it. Microsoft said it was to better recommend content to its users based on how many people lived in the house, but many saw it as an invasion of privacy. The PS4, on the other hand, had no major problems, no dumb gimmicks, and no privacy invasions. Then right near the end, Nintendo released the Switch, which is technically in 2 generations, the 6th and 7th, but we'll leave that for the 7th generation. In the end, PlayStation won out with both the PS3 and PS4. This all leads us to the current generation, where console wars have almost completely ceased to exist. With the addition of cross-platform games, most series that were console exclusive are coming to more platforms, with some exceptions. Halo still only comes out on Microsoft products, like the Xbox and Windows. The Last of Us and God of War are PlayStation exclusives. Death Stranding and Stray were initially PlayStation exclusives, but they eventually came to PC. Nintendo is really the only company that hasn't put their exclusive games out on other platforms, keeping it so that if you want to experience their games, you're gonna have to buy their console. In the end, console developers have settled into their own ways. Nintendo has their niche, Sony has the most powerful hardware, and Microsoft has their own experience. It's nice to be able to see gamers come together and experience the same games, no matter what console we have.
Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the video, consider liking. Want to keep up with what I'm doing? Consider subscribing as it helps me out a lot. Have any suggestions for videos? Leave a comment.